How's it going? This is Dylan with Dylan Pickups and Dylan Talks Tone, and this is this week's podcast where we discuss guitar tone, anything to do with your sound from your pick to your pickups to your guitar to everything ongoing all through the guitar to the other side and out to your amp and stuff. So this week we're going to talk about something very, very interesting. I've been getting a lot of requests for this, and I was actually going to shoot it, and I will shoot a video on YouTube for this because it's easier with some visual aids. But this week we're going to still talk about gain and how what gain is, first of all, and how we use it, and how we would stack it, for instance, because that's a big one. People want to talk about stacking gain all the time, and they use the overdrive pedals, plus they use their amp and distortion pedals and such. So, first of all, let's talk briefly about what gain is, okay? So, specifically, the word gain, when it comes to anything in an electronic circuit, means that when you take one value of voltage or power, we'll use those two things because those most closely relate, in a two-port circuit. So that means an in and an out. So you take a voltage or power from one side, you bring it in to an amplifier, and it goes out the other side. The amount that goes up is gain. Okay, so it's a relative thing. So when our guitar signal hits our overdrive pedal or our boost pedal or our amplifier, then the input signal goes in at one level and it comes out the other side at another level, probably higher, and that difference is the gain. That is gain. Why do we hear overdrive? Why do we hear crunch usually when we use gain? We need to understand, first of all, what we're doing with that signal when we do this. So every audio, and this is why I want to shoot a video on it because it's easier to see it in video, but every audio signal, you know, we know what a sine wave looks like, right? An audio signal. Every amplification device is capable of making a certain amount of increase in that signal. So it starts out as one size and it gets bigger. That's what the amplifier does. And it does it to a certain point where it can't get any bigger. And in order for it to get bigger, it squishes it. And that is when we hear that crunchy tone that we all know and love. Okay, so when that amplifier gets, and usually it's not like on 10. You know, usually like a tube amp is what, between 5 and 7 somewhere, depending on the amplifier. I've got a 4-watt amp that comes on way earlier than that, where that signal remains cleanly increasing in size until a certain point where it starts to distort. That is what we all love that sound. That's why we do this, right? Now, the interesting thing about this is that the amount of increase, the amount of gain in that amplifier, it is subject to a bunch of different variables. The power of the amplifier, first of all, and the characteristics of the amplifier, the ability of the amplifier to make the signal bigger without changing the shape of the signal, okay? Because every amplifier is going to introduce a little bit of change into that signal. So it comes in at a certain level and it goes out the other side bigger, but also a little bit different, okay? And the other thing is that every signal is different. So the gain of signal, the amount that it goes up, and what it sounds like when it comes out the other side, also varies with what it sounds like when it first come in. And that sounds stupid, like, of course it does. what it sounds coming in and is going out. But the thing is that every amp also has a ability to amplify certain frequencies better than others. And why do we talk about all this? Because one of my favorite, I'm not going to say it's my favorite, it's probably my least favorite, but it's also some of the most entertaining posts on social media and in forums is, what kind of overdrive pedal should I get? Or what do you think about this overdrive pedal? Is it going to sound good? Or I want to get this kind of amp. Is it going to sound good? There are so many variables in this. This is why it's very, very important to understand what's happening because, and honestly, I'm just going to say it straight to realize how stupid that question is, okay? Because we, as players, control the frequency. Now, we can get into the pickups and all that stuff, but our hands mostly control the frequency that enters the amplifier to be increased and come out the other side, okay? So, the fact that the potential for that signal to get bigger and sound different as it comes out the other side has as much to do with what we put in as what comes out, okay? So first of all, knowing that most of that sound comes from our hands and how we interact with the guitar, we've talked about this in many, many podcasts, goes into the amplifier and it gets bigger, and then it comes out the other side and it sounds a little bit different. So we have the variation of our hands. We have the variation of the ability of the amplifier to increase that sound accurately. And then we have it coming out the other side. Then we add to this the fact that most of the time what we want to have happen as guitar players is we want to squish that signal, right? We want to compress it. We want that signal to get bigger until it can't get bigger anymore. We want it to compress and then come out the other side. The ability for the amplifier, whether it be a pedal or the actual amplifier, guitar amplifier itself, to do this is also variable. And the interesting part about it is that every amplifier, be it a pedal or a guitar amp, does this with varying abilities. And invariably, the sound will sound different when it comes out the other side. One of my favorite buzzwords that we hear in groups and on Facebook and on the internet all the time is transparent overdrive. What's the most transparent overdrive? Well, I want to hear my overdrive. It's kind of a goofy word to say, transparent overdrive. But what people are really trying to say is they don't want the signal to sound tonally different as it comes out of the amp than it did when they first put it in. That is technically impossible. However, there are some overdrives, especially pedals. We can think of like a Ibanez Tube Screamer, for instance, or many of the variants that go on that particular pedal. Put like a mid-range bump into it a little bit. There are many others that do all kinds of sorts of things. They scoop the mid-range out. They put a little bit of bass in. They put, with an active circuit, they can add bass. They can add treble. All these things are all variables. But what we need to understand is what we're doing first. We are bringing in a signal. We are bringing up to the point of compression. We are squishing that signal, and it is not what we started with. Okay? And remember that what we put in is the number one thing that affects it. So now when we start talking about stacking overdrives, well, what does this mean? Well, a lot of people like to use an overdrive pedal or a boost pedal in front of their amplifier to have two different levels of overdrive. They call it stacking overdrives or stacking gain. We have to be very careful with this, though, because what are we trying to do? Are we trying to actually get louder for portions of our musical composition, or are we trying to add more distortion? Are we trying to screw up that signal more? That is an interesting goal to have because, and here's the reason. When we start out, with the signal. We obviously want it to get louder. We want the guitar to just not hear what we hear in our lap. We want it to get louder to be heard by our audience. So first of all, how loud do we want the amp to be? Okay? How loud do we want to be? We pick that, right? And when we pick that, do we want it to be a little bit saturated already, a little bit compressed already, distorted? Or do we want it to be completely clean at its loudest? Okay, we need to pick that point first. That's going to determine, and I'm just speaking in generalizations here, but that's going to determine how powerful an amp we have, right? Because a very low wattage amp is not going to go very loud before it starts to come apart. Okay, so if we need to be really loud, then we need a 50 watt or 20 watt or a 50 watt or a 100 watt amp, right? And not as big of an amp as we think. Remember that every time you double the power, and this is something to remember, every time you double the power of your amplifier, you gain approximately 3 dB in overall volume. Okay, so to go from a 15 watt amp to a 30 watt amp, you only gain about 3 dB. Okay, now that's a nonlinear thing because 120 to 130 dB is a lot louder than 70 to 80 dB. But where do we want to be? Okay, do we want to be in that 85 dB louder than conversation range? Then where do we want to be? So we put ourselves there first. Do we want the signal to be clean? Okay, so if we want the signal to be clean, then we get the amp to put it there with the power stage of that amp. So this is where we kind of have to start working backwards. Because if we want to get it clean at that volume level, then the power stage of the amp needs to be able to do that. Because usually, remember, each amplifier, guitar amplifier, actually has kind of 2 amps in it, right? It has a preamp and a power amp. So if the preamp or the power amp can create that level at the level that we want without being dirty, and we balance that with the preamp, okay? Because remember, if we squish either one of those things, it's over, okay? We're not getting any louder than that, really. So, and we work backwards, really, to our pedal board. Because if we start just hitting the amplifier from the front end with a pedal on the floor with a bunch of gain, then we end up basically never being able to back out of that because we are squishing the input signal. So it just kind of depends how we want to do that. I'm going to actually do, and this is a very difficult thing to visualize, so I'm going to actually do a video on this where I want to show you how we cascade, or what it means when we say, when we send our power amp into overdrive, or our preamp into overdrive, or the pedal in front of it, and how that really has a cascading effect on through the signal chain, because it all kind of affects each other. Because the other thing about it too is that every time you squeeze a signal, compress a signal, it changes the frequencies that you have to work with, if that makes sense. So that means that every guitar, every pair of hands, every tone setting, every amplitude as far as how loud it is, what notes we play. Are we higher on the frets? Are we lower on the fretboard? All those things are factors. So the next guy sitting next to me would hate the same overdrive pedal that I use, because even if we matched rigs, because of how we play is different. So this is a very complex thing, and I guess the whole reason of talking about it tonight is to remember the things that really, really matter, okay? So the gain of any kind of amplifier it really, really varies with the frequencies of the input that's put into it. So that means how you play, because you are the input to your whole circuit. And a lot of people say, well, the guitar is and the pedal is the first thing that it hits. No. The frequency that goes into the circuit affects how that amplifier acts, because every amplifier amplifies a signal differently. So that means that the frequency you put into it with your hands is the first step. Okay? And you need to understand how you put input into it, and you need to understand what you want to hear out of it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to shoot a video, and we're going to talk about those in-between stages and how when they come one right after the other like that, what that really means and how we can affect it. Because we can have a really, really clean signal and just kick it just a little, or we could have a really crazy overdriven signal, and we could have everywhere in between. And you could do it with one pedal. You could do it with no pedals, just with the guitar and the amp. So we just we'll need to talk about that some more. Like I said, it's a pretty complex thing, but the main reason I brought it up tonight is because people think that you can make a decision just based on well, you can't make a decision on this kind of thing based on what everybody else does. It's really about how you play the instrument. So we're going to discuss this more in the future. Again, my name is Dylan. This has been Dylan Talks Tone and Dylan Pickups. Hopefully it just gives you some thinking when you think about the fact that you are the first input to your circuit. And I always say that in different things, but it's the most important part, and it's the most important thing to really think about, is you are the most important part of the circuit, given that all these other components, pedals, amps, pickups, everything have a finite ability to reproduce the frequencies that you are putting into it. They all have limitations. You're the only one that doesn't. You're the only thing that doesn't have limitations. So you have to decide what everything's a give and a take, right? Everything's kind of a compromise. So you have to decide what you want out of it and what you're going to put into it before we can pick those middle stages. Because the amplifier and the to me, really the preamp and the pedals that you put in front of it are really the things that really matter. So as far as variables that can change so much about how you sound. So my name is Dylan. This is Dylan Pickups. Please check us out at dylanpickups.com. Check us out at dylantalkstone.com. And check out our YouTube channel, because we're going to be shooting some videos about this. I need to draw some pictures and really show you in video, because this is a pretty cool deal. Anyway, we will talk to you next week.